I'm Kashan and you are watching The Book Archer. I'm so excited about this video, although I feel like I say I'm so excited about this video at the beginning of every video. But I'm excited about this one because it's really more of a subscriber request. She was asking me about some good books to start with if you're trying to get into the fantasy genre, and I've gotten this question a lot, especially since a lot of series that have die-hard followings are fantasy series, and it can be really daunting if fantasy is not a genre that you read a lot. And then there are multiple types of fantasy. You have adult fantasy, what was I finna say, the night Mistborn, what else? You have urban fantasy, so it can be a whole lot. Today I am going to be giving you book recommendations, fantasy for beginners. The first series that I am going to be recommending, The Winter's Curse Trilogy by Marie Rutkoski, and that includes The Winter's Curse, The Winter's Crime, and The Winter's Kiss. This is a non-magical fantasy world that follows majority political intrigue and character-driven storylines and plot. The whole entire world is fantastical, one that the author has created. That is really where the fantasy point of it ends. As far as the plot of the book, this book follows a general's daughter. There are two worlds that are really at war here, and throughout the trilogy you kind of get to see how this war plays out between all of these political players. You do get to see the world build and expand throughout the stories and throughout all three of the books, but it's definitely not overwhelming, so this is a great one to start with. My next suggestion is a very popular series right now. It's not necessarily one of my personal favorites. I've only read the first book in it, but that is the Red Queen was trilogy. So I don't know how many books it is now, 4 or 5, but I don't own Red Queen, the first book. I have the second book here, Glass Sword. When I first read Red Queen my initial thoughts were that it felt like a lot of other books that I've already read before. It felt like it kind of took different tropes from all of those and put it together. But whenever I hear people who don't normally read fantasy books read Red Queen, they love it, they devour it. And I think it's just because since I read the genre so much, it is a little bit harder to impress me when I pick up a new series, because it's kind of like, oh, seen it all, done it all. You really have to be unique to catch my eye. But this is a great one to follow if you're just getting into fantasy, because it doesn't feel only like a fantasy. This series feels like literally a cross between dystopian and fantasy. It has dystopian and fantasy elements together, and it has one of the easiest fantastical magic systems to follow. And the first book is very fast-paced in my opinion. The language isn't hard to follow. You just want to read something that has a fantasy feel to it but doesn't feel completely foreign, then I would definitely suggest picking up the Red Queen trilogy. The next series that I want to recommend that's a fantasy series is technically urban fantasy. I wasn't really trying to include urban fantasy in this video, but I thought that this one was great to include because the urban elements are very minimal and you kind of get transported to another world. This is the Switch trilogy by Hocking. This includes Switch, Torn, and Ascend. Hocking's writing style is very easy to read, so when you read these books you won't be confused and it won't feel info dumpy, like there is a ton of information that you have to try and figure out. These were pretty popular about 4 or 5 years ago. Since then the hype of them has died way down. There isn't a lot of pressure to read this and love this. A lot of times when you're picking up popular fantasy series, there comes that pressure of like you not wanting to be the only one who doesn't like it. And if you're already not a fantasy reader, who wants to deal with that? So you can just pick these up. They're quick reads. The main character is from our world, but then she discovers some other things later on in the story. So you're kind of discovering the world at the same time with the main character. You don't feel like you're just dropped into a plot where everyone else is aware of how the world works except for you. I'll probably give these a reread really soon just to refresh myself. I'm curious to see if I'll still love them as much as I did the first time. The next one that I want to mention, Percy Jackson and the Olympians series. Not only is this a great one to get into because it is middle grade and it's not hard to read at all, but the main character is really funny, and all of Rick Riordan's books are based on mythology. So if you're trying to get into like fantasy books in the fantasy genre, read stories that have characters or themes that you're already familiar with. So retellings are the way to go. You already know who Zeus is and Poseidon and all of those people, and it's in middle grade form. Like, you can't really go wrong. And a lot of people who got introduced to the fantasy genre were introduced through this book series. The next one that I want to mention is also a retelling, The Wrath of the Dawn by Renee Ahdieh. I picked this book specifically because this is a character driven fantasy story. The setting to me plays in the background of the main character and her love interest. It's not central to driving the plot. I don't feel like this is a vast fantasy world. A lot of the first book takes place in the castle, and that is a very easy setting to grasp. It still has suspense and it still has those fantastical feels and elements. Another great thing about this is a duology. Most fantasy series are at least 4 books. A lot of them are 6 books and so on, and that's a lot of commitment if you don't even know if you're gonna like the genre. So starting off with the duology is a great option and a great idea, and that is why I would recommend this one. The next one that I want to mention is An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir. I picked this specifically because this one doesn't feel like any other fantasy book that I've read. This is kind of based on Roman society. Most fantasy feels like King Arthur, Knights at the Round Table type of era, but this one doesn't give me that vibe. And this one has less of a magical elements when you're reading the first book. The main elements that you're really following is some of the competition things that happen and some of the things that are happening to one of the main characters. This also has multiple perspectives, but they're all easy to follow. So this is a great introduction to fantasy stories that have different perspectives. And last but not least, I wanted to include one that I would say is a little bit intermediate. It doesn't necessarily have to be the very first fantasy book or series that you pick up, but I still feel like it is good for people who are newer to the fantasy genre. Fallen Kingdoms by Morgan Rhodes. This is a 6-book series, and the first 5 books are already out. The last book comes out this year. I'll just show you guys the first 3 because that's what I have right beside me, but that is Fallen Kingdoms, Rebel Spring, and Gathering Darkness. This one is a great introducer to fantasy because there are tons and tons of plots, twists, and turns throughout the entire story. It is easy to stay engaged with this one. You never know what's going to happen, and for some reason this one really reminds me of like Shakespeare. It just has a Shakespearean vibe to me. If you're used to like the way that his stories take place, where he has large casts of characters but you can still follow it, I would definitely pick up Fallen Kingdoms. I don't feel like the magic system is hard to understand, but this is definitely a series that will give you a real taste of what high fantasy will be like once you start getting into your more high fantasy books. Combination of magical systems, character driven stories, and plot twists. I know that was a lot of recommendations. I really wanted to provide some variety. If you have a question about any of these series, just leave it down below. Which ones are you thinking about picking up? And if you're a fantasy reader, what were some of the first fantasy series that you read and loved? What are some great fantasies that you would recommend for people who are not used to reading the fantasy genre? Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Snapchat at theBookArcher. And I will see y'all in my next video. Bye!